Welcome to Atheists Talk. I'm Stephanie Zvan. If you listen to atheists for any length of time, discussions of ethics will definitely come up. And that shouldn't be too surprising because for religious people, they have already a framework from which they get their ethics. It comes directly from their religion, generally directly from their gods. But since atheists obviously don't believe in any supernatural entities, we can't get our ethics from there. So we talk about it a lot, but we don't always go back and talk about the basics of what ethics is and how we derive our ethics. Or even, let's just say whether we're talking about something that's plural or singular. My guest tonight is George Kane. He's been a member of Minnesota Atheists for nearly 20 years. He's served on our board of directors in several roles and is on several longstanding committees. George graduated in 1970 from the University of California at Berkeley with a degree in philosophy. So when we are talking about ethics, what are we talking about?
Well, ethics is a branch of philosophy. There is a broader division called axiology, which is a theory of value. And axiology is broken into two divisions, aesthetics and ethics. And generally what we mean by ethics is a theory of obligation. It's what people should do as opposed to how things are. But it's obligation becomes the key concept.
And of course, anybody can tell us that there are things that we should do. What does philosophy do for us in this regard? How do we go about systematically deriving ethics?
Yeah, there's almost an axiom in philosophy that you cannot derive an ought from an is. That is, you can't define what obligations are by any condition of fact. Now, this isn't strictly true. For example, if one makes a promise to do something, then because of the fact of that promise, there's something they should do, which is to keep the promise or pay a debt, for example. But most of the work of ethics involves coming up with a conceptual framework for values. That when you combine conditions of fact with values, then you get an obligation.
And does everybody agree on what kind even of framework we should be using? I assume not, because we're talking about philosophers.
No. There's a question of how do you derive the values? And this breaks down into two basic camps. There's deontology and consequentialism. In deontology, certain things are good or right just because of what they are. Examples of this, in theistic morality, the actions are good because they've been proclaimed so by God, as for example in the Ten Commandments, let's say. Or that actually lists things which are the opposite, which are bad or evil or sinful. But even in non-theistic ethical systems, there are deontological values that are often stated and used for as a structure for a theory of obligation. One that you hear frequently these days among atheists is evolution. The idea that humans earlier in their history had behaviors that were selected for their survival value because they helped people live in society. And I'm really skeptical of that one. I'm skeptical of most of evolutionary psychology. But there are other ways to get values too. Some ethical systems are based upon not actions, but upon values of character, such as something as they look upon courage as good or honesty as good. I'm a little skeptical of that too, if what you're trying to find is a way to derive good action, because certainly an action can be courageous, but not lead to good results, can be very, very harmful. Or honesty. There are lots of times when honesty may not lead to the best results. There was a question that was popular in the middle of the 19th century about what was it, truth-telling Baptists and lying Baptists, that if an Indian war party stops you and asks you which way did the wagon train go, that the truth-telling Baptists would indicate where they went, which would lead to them being wiped out, of course. So there are different systems. One that's interesting is rationalism. Now, in rationalism, you try to reason through to the truth by avoiding contradiction. An example of that would be if I kill, no, why is it bad to kill someone? Would be the question. Well, if I kill someone, implicit in that action is that under certain circumstances it would be okay for him or someone else to kill me. And if that answer is unacceptable, then we have a rule that follows from that you shouldn't kill people.
Because it creates an inconsistency.
Right.
So everything we're talking about so far is a deontological system, a system where something is proclaimed to be good and then ethical actions. What is an ethical action or what isn't an ethical action is derived from that.
Right.
You also mentioned consequentialist ethics.
Consequentialism, sure. In consequentialism, the moral value of an action is based upon the harm or benefit that results from it in people's lives. So there are different consequentialist systems. Hedonism, for example, is based on the idea that what I want is what's pleasurable for me, and that the good actions are the ones that end up giving me one form or another of pleasure. But much more common, and atheists are accused by Christians all the time of just being hedonists. Why would they be anything else? But a much more popular system of consequentialism, the most popular certainly, is altruistic consequentialism, which is called utilitarianism. Now, there are two main branches of utilitarianism. The one is act utilitarianism, in which the moral value of an action is just based upon the harm and benefit that derives from that action in people's lives. Rule utilitarianism says that the moral enterprise is coming up with good rules, which exploring experience to decide what actions in general lead to the best results in terms of a surplus of benefit in people's lives to harm that's produced. Now, I have some problems with rule utilitarianism. It doesn't seem to me that it's really consequentialism, because the value of an action is based not in the consequences of that action, but on adherence to a rule. Now, the deontological systems are all based upon these rules that they draw, which are structured differently. The Ten Commandments, for example, is an example of canonical ethical system that's just based on a list of rules.
Okay, so when we're talking about considering ethics on a practical basis, mm-hmm. do people outside of perhaps philosophy journals tend to stick with one method of
Yeah.
creating their ethics?
Yeah, good question, good question. And in practice, just about everyone has to rely on moral intuition a lot, rely on just their intent as justifying it morally. When strictly speaking, that's not a sufficient theoretical basis, I'd say. Now, there are different ways at looking at the moral enterprise, what it is that we want ethics to do. One way that, the way that it's most commonly looked upon is how do we decide what we should do? There's another way that I think is important, and that's an after-the-case fact. How do we evaluate the moral value of actions that have been taken? Now, the difference between these two is a matter of a point in time. That when we are considering, when we're making a decision as to what we should do, this is very difficult for a consequentialist, especially an act utilitarian, because the moral value of his action is based upon what results from it, but that's often undetermined. We don't know what is going to happen from it. We may have some idea, but are unable to, to see what all the consequences in people's lives are going to be. On the other hand, in most cases, after the fact, we can pretty much make the decision by the model of the scale. You know, on one side you put all the things that have been benefits in people's lives that has resulted from the action. On the other side you put all the things that have been harmful that resulted from it, and see which way the scale tips. Now, so we're in this in this awkward position of that we're deciding what to do, and we don't know what all the consequences will be. So how do you resolve that? How is it that an act utilitarian isn't frozen with indecision all the time? And first off, most cases, you have to act. You have to do something. Now,
not acting still has consequences.
That's right. Not acting still has consequences, exactly. So, act utilitarians do sometimes have to depend on common sense or rules of thumb or moral intuition, and but later on we can look at the action and decide, was it the right action, or would some other course of action have led to better consequences? Now, that result is something that a lot of people whom I've discussed this with have problems with. It's hard for them to accept that they can do the thing that, with the best of intentions, that follows the rules that they think are good rules, and yet it turns out to be a mistake. But really, we find that in everything else. Why is it so difficult to accept with respect to ethics? They want to excuse themselves with the excuse that, well, I had a good intent. I wanted something good to happen. But in fact, something else would have been a better course because we've seen the results. So I think that a consistent consequentialist has to be able to say, yes, there are times when I made a mistake. I had the best of intentions, but I did the wrong thing.
Another form of resistance, I think, to an organized code of ethics that I come across is people who are coming out of that very rule-based system of religion who have become, because many of those rules either have bad consequences or were unworkable in some way or another, very resistant to the whole idea of being told what people should do. How do you address that?
Yeah, ethics is a difficult field to work with, because while different people come up with consistent frameworks, it's usually possible for people to deny the fundamental basis of it. My postulation that the right moral action is what leads to the greatest good for the greatest number. It's possible for people to disagree with that. Now, one thing that I'd like to do in any discussion with someone who's not a utilitarian, not a consequentialist, is ask him, would you actually feel that the correct action in some cases is not what leads to the greatest benefit over harm in people's lives? And if so, I think that for purposes of the argument in the audience, that we should find out what that is. When do you think a more harmful action would be better? But it is possible for people to deny the value of utility or benefice. So, and I think that's the case with just about every other ethical system. There was a conference recently on the future of humanism, which you were a participant at, and there was a discussion about humanistic values. And anytime that anyone asserts a value, just deontologically, that it's good in itself, I always wonder, can't someone say, well, no, I don't think that's good? So it's for this reason that people can question the very basis of it, that will probably never reach a universal acceptance of a single ethical framework. But it's certainly something we can talk about and I think the more people think about it, talk about it, the greater convergence that there will be among people. There is, by the way, a school of thought that obligations come only from agreements, and the rules and laws of society are nothing more than what has been either agreed upon or imposed on people, and that the laws of one, you can't evaluate the laws of one society based on the laws of another society. And so this is a strict conventionalism, but also relativism. And I have problems with those, because I do think that the laws of one society may have very different results in the lives of the people who are affected by it than a different set of rules that are adopted in a different society.
So context matters as well. Another thing that comes up frequently in discussions of ethics is that question of whether it is possible to have objective ethical standards.
Yeah.
And I think you touch on it a little bit with the question of relativism. Is there anything else you want to say to that?
Sure. In systems like Christianity, they always claim that their morality is objective. Well, why is it objective? Because it's codified in a book, the Bible. So if your action is in conformance with the demands of the Bible, then it's subjectively good. But what is objectively good about the Bible if we deny that there is any moral authority to it? Because there's no creative God. Whereas consequentialism, I think, has a solid basis for a claim of objectivity. That basis is that actions do have real consequences in people's lives. So an action is made. Do people benefit from it? Are they harmed by it? And that is an objective condition of fact that we can look at and determine.
Although, even if we are looking at objective standards, that doesn't mean that we as observers and people trying to evaluate our own behavior are going to be objective about that.
Yeah, a very good point. And it determines, I think, a lot of how we evaluate actions. If we're considering some social welfare program, for example, do I say, well, that's going to result in the greatest benefit over harm in people's lives, and therefore that's something that I should do? Well, in matter of fact, it's probably the approach that any of us will have to take, but it's not, I think, the exhaustive approach that you should take. Rather, if this were being done after the fact, you would ask a person not, do you think that this has resulted in harm or benefit? What you would do is ask each person affected by the program, has this helped or harmed you? And to what degree? In what ways? Don't ask them about how it affects other people, because then you're only weighing your own subjective biases. And ask each person who's affected by this program whether it helped them or harmed them. And then you can bring out your scale and weigh to get the total effect.
So, and obviously you're talking about asking them, but if there are better ways, more objective ways to measure, that is also a...
Oh, sure.
Right.
Sure. In terms of expenses, in terms of people covered by the program, how many people are not covered by the program and still in bad conditions because of that and so on.
I have to ask in part because we have just gone through an election in which people who were asked about various harms and or consequences of particular political decisions that people made were not necessarily accurate in how they assessed that.
And as a matter of fact, a lot of what people believe has been influenced by fake news. And that seems to be more of an issue now than it's ever been, which is a real disappointment to me, because I would have thought that in the information age, it would be possible for people to make better decisions, be better informed, and instead we're seeing the opposite effect from it.
So you mentioned earlier a system of going back through and evaluating actions after they happen, and coming up with things like rules of thumb. When we were preparing for the program, you mentioned something called rule utilitarianism.
Yes.
Is that basically that same process?
Right.
Is there anything more you'd like to say about that?
Rule utilitarianism, which was associated with John Stuart Mill, holds the position that the enterprise of ethics is to use our experience to formulate rules of conduct, rules that are going to lead to the greatest surplus of benefit over harm in the lives of the most people. And as I said, I'm not completely comfortable with that. I think it's not, that in the end it is not really consequentialism, because the basic concept, I think, in consequentialist ethics is that people are responsible for the consequences of their actions. Any rule that you come up with is going to have exceptions to it. And I think that one of the most important vital skills of a moral agent is to be able to recognize situations in which the normal rules don't apply. in which case following the rule is not a virtue.
Right. And again, we get into issues where our frameworks may be objective, but we aren't necessarily.
That's right. People may be influenced by personal biases or preferences for certain people when, as I said, utilitarianism is altruistic consequentialism, that the effect of an action to anyone else is just as important as its effect to me.
So basically, as we're coming up on the end of the program, what I'm getting here is that this sort of thing is complicated and difficult to put into action, but probably still better than just sort of winging it.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that a decent way of putting it?
Yeah, I'd say so. Generally, most people living in pretty affluent, comfortable situations tend to be considerate of others, and so there's a large convergence in the ethical quality of their behavior. The range is generally pretty good. When people grow up in desperate, poverty, war-torn situations, we can find that their actions are not what we, in conformance with what we consider to be ethical conduct under more pleasant situations.
All right. Well, thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
Is there anything, any place you'd like to send people really quickly for more information if they want to follow up on this?
Yeah, I'm sure I've given myself away that my preference for ethical system is consequentialism. There is a site, actually two sites, or two ways to get there, same site, utilitarianism.com and utilitarianism.org.
Excellent.
Both
Thank
have
you
an
very
enormous
much.
library of
Wonderful.
articles.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This has been Atheists Talk. I'm Stephanie Zvan, happy to host this for Minnesota Atheists. If you want to find out more about Minnesota Atheists, you can go to minnesotaatheists.org. We have a whole bunch of information on the organization. You can go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. You can sign up for our meetup group and get to know other people with interests like these. And that's about it. So please, if you're interested in us, God.